Okay. Hello, everyone. Hi. Okay, thanks for joining me here today. As viewers are slowly streaming in, we'll wait a little bit. Yeah, I have a viewer count. I can actually see how many people have joined us already. And right now, my viewer count says 41. Okay, so we are broadcasting on both the Facebook platform as well as on YouTube. So our viewers are on both platforms. And of course, you can interact with us by posting your comments. We'll get to see those comments. We'll pull them out as and when for any of our guests today to answer. Okay. Within a minute, we now have 109 viewers. Don't panic, guests. This happens online. That's one of the most beautiful things about doing stuff virtually, right? People can just join us from their homes remotely without needing for us to gather physically in a space, without commuting, etc. Okay, all right. We are clocking in at 146 people right now. What do you think the threshold should be before you start?
1,000.
I think we'll never start, Joel. If it's 1,000. No. But now it's 145. You ready to? I sound like a croupier or something like that. Huh? You ready to go up a bit more? Now it's 156.
I think we're good.
You're good? Okay.
It's not a seafood auction, Alfian.
Right. Okay. So right now we are at 185 viewers. I would like to thank all of you who are tuning in tonight for spending your evening with us today. We're going to have 1 hour's worth of what I hope will be very enriching and insightful conversations about race and anti-racism and a lot of things that's happening in the world right now. Okay, so to start off, I would like my guests to introduce themselves one by one. Yeah, so we're going to start with Pooja Nansi.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so I'm Pooja. I'm a poet, I'm a performer. I still sit slightly uncomfortably with the title of playwright, but I have done written work specifically for the theatre. And I work and live in Singapore. I currently run the Singapore Writers Festival, and I'm also part of the organizing team for Other Tongues, which is a minority voices festival in Singapore. And we had our first edition in 2018.
Thank you so much for that, Pooja. Wonderful. Okay, next up, let's hear from Joel.
Hi, my name is Joel Tan. I am a playwright, a dramaturg, and sometimes a director and performer. I'm currently based in London, but I'm here in Singapore in my parents' flat because I fled to wait out the pandemic.
Yeah. Thank
in
you,
a
Joel.
nominally safer place. Yeah, sorry.
Right, you had no confidence in herd immunity, I suppose.
No, what good has it done anyone?
Right. Okay, thank you so much for that, Joel. And next up, we have Vithya Subramaniam.
Hey, hi, I'm Vithya. I guess I'm another UK evacuee because I left Oxford where I go to school for DPhil in anthropology. And I've written 2 plays, so if Alfian says that I'm a playwright for those 2, then okay lor.
You are.
Of course you are. Like, if you've written a play, so that makes you a playwright. I think that's the definition of it. Okay, thank you so much. So welcome all of you, including our 2 Singapore pandemic returnees. Okay, so I think to start off, maybe not a lot of people are familiar with the kind of stuff that we've been doing in theatre regarding discourses on race, right? Because I think sometimes we say, we don't really know how to talk about race, so let's try to avoid it, or we walk on eggshells around it. But I do believe that in some of your works, you have managed to find a way to actually discuss it in ways that's sensitive and respectful, right? And not inflammatory. I think there's always this fear that race talk is incendiary or inflammatory. Yeah. So let's start. by looking at some of the works that you have produced, and I think I'm very excited about this. Let's see the slides. I'm excited because so many of these plays were actually produced in the past 10 years. So what do you call that? 2010s onward is what? Do you call them the tens?
I must be right.
The teens, the tens? Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So there we go. This is an image from Cake Theatrical Productions. I think it's the play Being Harashama. Yeah. So our panel today is called I Cannot See You, Racial Representation and Anti-Racism in Performance. And the phrase I cannot see you is, of course, based on this very tired and very old joke that some of us must have experienced as we were growing up about, oh, if I switch off the light, I cannot see you. If you smile, I can only see your eyes and your teeth, etc. Yeah. But I think it's also a kind of opening for us to discuss issues like presence and visibility and how seen we are, yeah, in both the stage and society. Okay, let's look at our first slide here. Okay, so we're gonna start with Pooja. Pooja, tell us a little bit about this play that you've done.
So this piece you are here started out actually as a conversation between me and Joel, who you see on the screen, just because we were friends and we liked hanging out, and I was a big fan of his work. And I was writing a lot of poems about my grandparents, and I just kind of felt like the poetry form wasn't doing what I wanted it to to explore like the kind of family history that I wanted to. And then Joel suggested a one-woman show. So it's a series of monologues, songs, just like me being ridiculous in skits, but it kind of explores my own family history of migration through like 3 generations, and like the love stories between my grandparents and my great-grandparents, and then what it was also like growing up first generation Singaporean in Singapore. Yeah.
Right. So could you tell us who's that beautiful woman in the background?
So that is my maternal grandmother, Padma Dave, and she must be like 18 in that photograph. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And Joelle, you were the director for this piece, right?
Yeah, director and dramaturg, and we did 3 different versions of it over the year 2016. Yeah.
I see. Okay, right. So Pooja, when you were creating this work, right, were you sort of acknowledging that maybe there was a gap in Singapore when it came to sort of Indian ethnicity narratives?
Not, I wouldn't say not overtly. Like at no point was I like, oh, I need to write an Indian narrative or I need to write into that gap.
Yeah.
For me, it felt very. I just really wanted to. It all started because I started finding all these super old, beautiful photographs, and I was like, "There's a real story here." And then I found letters that my parents were writing to each other throughout their courtship, and I just felt like I had all this material, and I wanted to do something with it. And then, I think in the course of writing the show, it became inevitable that I had to talk about Indianness and how complex that was to talk about. Because what is Indianness anyway?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that just made its way into the show, but it wasn't like that wasn't the impetus for writing it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I guess, I mean, as writers, writing from our own lives, the cloth of our own lives, and it's the autobiographical will definitely be the cultural as well, right? Yeah. It's not just the psychological. Yeah. And I think what's interesting about this work, Pooja, is that you start off with a story about an Indian wedding.
Oh yeah, it was. I was getting married in 2015, and so I think a framework that we used was just me trying to like plan this wedding in Singapore, and coming across all these sort of like strange biases about what spaces I could and could not use. And so that's what framed the show. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And where was it that you wanted to hold your wedding again?
I wanted to hold my wedding at N Parks, but I could not because Hindu weddings, Hot Park, yes. But I could not because Hindu weddings require a fire and like an open fire, an open flame. And so I think I was just like irritated because I was looking for wedding venues, and that's very frustrating. But it led to this like really kind of funny exchange with this poor bureaucrat on the receiving end of my wrath.
Right.
Who was just like, no, these are the rules. And like I was trying to explain to her, like culturally, what I needed, and like it was just a mess.
Right. Yeah. So I think, I mean, it was a very funny episode in your play, but I also felt that it revealed, that sometimes for some people, this kind of racial accommodation is an afterthought, right? It's not sort of like built into the design from the very beginning. It's something like, hey, yeah, I opened the book and your situation or your case doesn't seem to match any in the template, right?
Yeah.
So the people who are doing the designing, the templating, and all that, I guess, that particular request just completely like flaws them.
But I mean, I think that's also a legacy of like our very reductive CMIO model, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much, Pooja. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this work in 2018, Thick Beats for Girls. Yeah.
So Thick Beats for Good Girls was a collaboration between me and my very good friend Jessica Bellamy, who's a Jewish female playwright from Australia, and we just wanted to make work together, and we made a list of all the things that we loved, and the thing that stood out to us was hip hop. And I think it was just a work that we did with Checkpoint Theatre. It was a director and dramaturg by Hussein Sulaiman, and we talked about the intersections between both of us feeling like definitely identifying as feminists, but then loving this music that is so often quite misogynistic, but then also how much it meant for both of us as children of immigrants in like navigating our identity and our love for hip hop. So, and how it was just such a formative soundtrack for both of us. So it was basically just a love letter to hip hop. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I must say, I mean, there's this really beautiful monologue inside the play. Yeah, Pooja, where you mentioned about what it means to grow up brown in Singapore, and then to have this particular space where you see your people and they're playing your music, and you're dancing with abandon. Could you tell us a little bit about that space?
So I grew up dancing in these really kind of small. This was before hip hop was being played on the mainstream at all. So we're talking like maybe like 1999 to 2005. And I grew up dancing in all these really small hip hop clubs, so like places like Kilimanjaro's or Hendrix, Rum Runners, and they were just, I didn't realize it at the time, but in retrospect, they were just very brown spaces, and you only realize that when you no longer find spaces like that. So for me, it was just a real I just wanted to celebrate the spaces in which we all felt safe and we all like felt like we had a bit of a refuge, and we grew up dancing to that music, which isn't our music, it's African American music, but still it was a soundtrack for us at the time.
Right. Yeah. So do you notice this as a kind of a phenomenon in Singapore that minorities have really embraced hip hop music, for example? And do you see whether there's any explanation for this?
So I talked to a bunch of DJs who were spinning at the time, and why we were gravitating to that, and like none of us have a clear answer. But I think it was just firstly like the clubs that were playing mainstream or like techno music at the time were very posh. So like places like Zouk, or like there's a place called Madame Wong's that none of us could afford. And so we were just going to the shitty places where like honestly for $15 you could drink free flow from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. So we were just going to the different places. But then I think also a lot of the music just spoke to minority identity in some way. Yep. So, it's, I mean, I've heard all kinds of theories about like, about bass beats and how they're more prevalent in like, Malay, like DK Barat or like even traditional Indian music. And so like maybe that just felt
music, right?
So I don't know. I don't have a clear answer, but that's what it was.
Fantastic. So we've got like a few kind of like fan screams that I think I will just pull out. So Theo Chen says, "I know you are here." That's to you, Pooja. And someone, Josh Yim says, "Hello, Joel Tan. I love you."
Aww. I don't know who you are.
There you go. His name is Joshim.
He's a friend.
And Prashant says, shout out to Kilis. Is that
Kilimanjaro.
short for
Yeah.
Kilimanjaro, Pooja?
Yeah.
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 Someone is asking, is there a chance it could be staged again? I
There's
think this could be a
always a
reference to You Are
chance.
Here. There's always a chance, right? And
You are here, is it?
yes. And
Yeah.
Ivan says we love it at our theater. so
Great.
I mean, mark this space. This could be the genesis. Yeah, of You Are Here being revived. Okay, thank you so much, Pooja. Let's move on to the next slide. And let's talk a bit about some of the works that Vithya has done. Tell us a bit about Six of Serangoon.
Yeah, okay. I guess with this, it's kind of like, I got pulled into it because of my work on Six already, my academic work on Six. So Sid Fee got approached by IHC to stage something in their open air theatre, so on Clive Street. So it's right in the middle of Little India.
Okay, so hang on a second. Let me just explain. So SITFI is Singapore Indian Theatre and Film Explorers.
Exactly.
Okay, and then IHC is Indian Heritage Centre. Okay.
Exactly. Okay. Yep. Too many acronyms. So Salim Hadi from SITFI already knew he wanted to write about Sikhs. So he approached me, and I figured since we're gonna have the space in Little India, might as well use the space to inspire the story. Hence, it's set in Theka or in Little India in the 1930s. And I chose the 1930s because that was a nice piece of transition, a nice period of transition where the space itself is changing, who lives in the space, how they use the space is changing, and also because that's the time when more and more women, South Asian women, are coming in and settling in Singapore. So that's what the piece is about. It's all these characters from 1930s Little India.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Did you have to do a lot of research for that? For like 30s Singapore.
Well, the other reason for looking at the 30s because I was also familiar with the 30s, right? So I guess I was tapping on like earlier research as well. But so this is an attempt at place history. Yeah. I make it sound too easy.
I'm sure it's a lot of work. I'm sure it's so much research. And we have a little comment here by Upneet Nakpal. Subramaniam was an excellent, well-researched production. Yeah.
Thanks, Upneet.
And I want to find out also in terms of like plays about the Sikh or the Punjabi community in Singapore. Did you know of whether there were many before you embarked on this work?
So I've heard from like some of the older Sikhs that they would do community productions. So just like within the Gurdwara, but those are, trying to tell you like religious stories.
I see. Okay.
Okay. So nothing I know of that's been like similar like this, like a public stage story.
Right.
I know there are Sikh characters here and there in other plays. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the one I can think of is Hari Sharma's Discord and Others.
Right. Yes. That's right. Yeah. And I also want to find out what was the language used in this play?
Oh, intentionally everything. So there's a Malay character supposed to be Boyanis, so he speaks Malay. There's the Tamil lady, she speaks Tamil. The Punjabi guys sometimes speak Tamil, Punjabi. So it's a mix, primarily English, and then here and there they use whatever languages they speak in.
Right. Yeah. So I find it's really interesting because sometimes when we're doing a work about, say, community history, the issue of who is the audience comes into the picture, right? So who did you intend this audience to be, actually? I mean, it could be both like in-group and out-group as well, right? But as you were writing it, who do you envision?
Well, I was hoping to have non-Sikhs and just a more general audience come see it, but eventually we got primarily Sikhs, also because of the way marketing works. Primarily Sikhs, and then the second group would be just the broader scope of Indian people coming to watch it. But also because knowing that it's mostly going to be Sikhs who come watch it, I kind of also felt that I had to self-censor several things. So one thing is Six of Serangoon was not the original title.
Right, okay.
I had wanted it to be Vangali. so that I
Right.
can precisely, get into why the word Vangali is used and why people feel the way they feel about the term Vangali, right?
Right.
And very early on in the process, we got feedback apparently from the public, but I have my
Yep.
doubts that
Yeah.
we cannot use the word, that people are very offended by the word. So it's like
Okay.
even before I got to address the offense, people are already offended and it got shut down.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's really fascinating because I also remember a play where the playwright called it the and sorry if this sounds offensive, the K word, right? So
Mm.
the Kaling trilogy,
Mm.
and then he had to change it into the Kalinga trilogy
Mhm.
because again there was a feedback that people were not comfortable using that word.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is really interesting. Okay, can we look at the next slide? Okay, tell us a little bit about Coffee Maker, Vithya.
Right, so Coffee Maker came out last year. It's a short play, it's like 10 minutes, right? It's for late night texting. And here I was primarily, the impetus is really just someone said something to me and did something for me. And I was like, that's so crazy. And just like built a whole story around that.
Right.
But what I wanted to focus on with this is how objects can be actors as well. Because at this time, I was thinking with some of the anthropological theory about it's called actor network theory. So objects are also actors. They also have agency. They do things. They make people do things. So I was trying to write a story where, the coffee maker is not just a prop. It's also a character in the
Right.
story.
I see. Interesting. And the characters that are inside this play, were they specifically written for Indian actors or?
No, so even in the script, it just says he, she, and it could also have been A and B.
Right.
I like purposely did not even want to give them a name because a name would give them culture or something.
I see.
It just ends up being Indian actors because it's brown voices.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. We have some very interesting question, but we will go and address it later. There's someone called Geraldine. Okay, maybe I shall just pull this out, right? So Geraldine says, so far I have seen through pictures. You only cast your own people as well.
Who, me?
Yeah, you only cast your own people. So let's deal with this in a while. I think Geraldine, why don't you hang on until we sort of like go through the whole series of plays, and then maybe we'll go back to, because I think what she's saying is that maybe we are trying to argue for like more representation and all that, but it looks like we are only casting brown people. Where is representation from our side? Okay, but I think, Geraldine, if you look at specifically those plays, I mean, if it says 6 of Serangoon, I think, and already in Vithya's play, as you can see, there's actually like one Malay person in that picture there. So even though it's called 6 of Serangoon, there is a Malay character. Okay, and Geraldine says, Vithya, I have a question. So why did you do your marketing this way?
Because you got to hit where you're going to get the audience from, right? If you tell the Sikh community, hey, we're writing a play about you, then you're going to get like an 80% turn up from that attempt. It's really about how you use your time and energy instead of just trying to throw it all out and then only getting a 10% return.
Right. Yeah. No, exactly. And I think these kinds of things, when we publicize, obviously you reach out to the community first. Okay, I don't know what Kim Tan means about walao your own people.
I think that's in response to Karen.
She's responding to what Geraldine says about you casting your own people. But okay.
Is this where we clarify I am not Sikh?
Right, yes. So by the way, yes, make that clarification, Vithya.
I am not Sikh. Or Punjabi.
Right. Okay, come, let's see the next slide. Okay.
What a great time to talk about brown voices.
Yes, this is the best time to talk about brown voices. Okay. Yes. So Geraldine, please, thank you for answering. Okay.
Thanks, Geraldine.
So, Vithya, tell us a little bit about brown voices.
Yeah. Okay. So brown voices started off early 2019, but really grew out of a playwriting workshop we had with Alfian, that Grace Kali Sylvie led. And so the idea of brown voices, as you can see from the photo,
Yes.
it's a collective of brown writers, and brown really here means Indian, because there are
Right.
also collectives for other like Malay writers as well. Yeah.
Okay, great. And why do you think was one of the reasons you brought this collective together?
Oh, so
Yeah.
you can always say more people need to write, more brown people need to write, but when you just tell them that and then ask them to sit in their own rooms and write, nothing happens.
Yes.
As everyone who's tried to do homework, right? It's so much easier to do homework in like group study settings. So that's what the
Right.
idea is. It's a collective. We come together, we workshop ideas together. But it also helps because as one individual brown person, I'm not trying to represent all brown voices. And I also need to hear and want to hear how other brown people think about any topic, right? And that's why the idea of workshopping comes in.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. I mean, like when Grace also mooted the idea to me, I thought, oh, this is so important because, just as was mentioned, that I do feel that there's a gap in some forms of representation, especially in English language theatre. So there's an assumption that because we have vernacular theatres like Malay language and Mandarin language and Tamil language, that everyone is fairly represented. But actually, if we look at English language theatre, who are the Indian playwrights, for example, there's not that many, right?
Yeah.
Everyone will just say Hare Shama, but
Yeah. And can I also clarify that just because it's brown voices, that the stories are not just brown stories, it's not just only Indian stories, right? It's just people who happen to be Indian, and then they come and hang out with their friends.
Right.
And it's not like we don't have other friends lah.
Of course. Of course, I don't think it's got that kind of exclusivity, yes. And Fiacre Ross has a comment here, and he says yet another example of the inadequacies of the CMIO model. Vithya Subramaniam is not Sikh or Punjabi, yet is rendered as Indian and only casting her so-called own people. Right? So I think he's referring to what Geraldine was saying just now, right? As to why we are talking about own people and all that, because that word own is so somehow tethered to the idea of the CMIO. Who are our people? Right? Who's your people, y'alls? Okay. Let's go on to the next image. And now we go to Joel Tan. Okay, so I have to say that, Joel Tan is really one of my favorite playwrights. Tonight, he also appears as a human shield, Joel. Because he's also here to deflect any kind of criticism by people who say, oh, talking about race, how come only brown people can talk about race? I also, where are the non-brown people? So we have Joel, right? So he's your non-brown token representation who's going to talk about race today. Okay, so Joel, bring us through some of your works. So let's start with Mosaic.
On that note, I shall be brief. Okay. I don't think I want to dwell too much on each one of them, so maybe we could just cycle through all three. Sure. So this is a grab from a play called Mosaic, which was staged in 2015. The next one should be Cafe.
Right. Next slide. Yes.
Yeah. And then the next one is Tango, right?
Okay, great.
So I think like my way in for this panel, I think obviously is about the fact that in my plays, I consciously try and make space for characters who are not Chinese, right? Okay. And I guess we can talk about that in more detail later, but it's something that I've realized in my own practice has become quite important to me, and that looking back at this work, I could have done so much better, but but going forward, it's definitely something that like I think about very consciously, right? And I think also it's kind of like my way in today is talking about You Are Here as well, because like it was a very intense and enjoyable process that Pooja and I had that taught me personally a lot about what it means to hold space, what it means to listen, and what it means to center, stories of marginalization and home seeking and all of that. So I kind of don't want to talk too much about my own work, but we can talk broadly about, my approach to writing roles and talking about race in my plays. Because like the thing about all three of these plays is that race is present, but they are not directly, questioning race or asking questions about race. But that's not to say race isn't a part of the texture. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. And actually, Joel, I mean, just on a personal note, right? So when I watch your three plays, and I just want to say that yes, there is a character who's non-Chinese, and I've always felt, so many playwrights in Singapore and elsewhere will say, okay, I shouldn't write about something I don't know, and this becomes an excuse for them to only write about people from their culture. But when I watch your plays, I just feel, gosh, you've done it and you've managed to do it respectfully. And actually, this has got like wider ramifications because as a playwright, when you write roles that, let's say specific is a Malay character, you're also providing employment, providing roles for actors out there. Yeah. And this is the way for the actors to grow, to keep on, finding roles. And then, and there's always this argument, which is that, I don't know any brown actors, or they're new, or they're untested, but if you don't write those roles, if you don't give them those roles, they will never mature as actors, right? Someone like Siti Khalijah. Yeah.
Exactly. It's like, it came at a point where I realized that I write primarily, when I first started writing, I realized I write primarily for the enjoyment of actors. So thinking about, the wider kind of like logistical parameters around my plays is also important to me. So exactly that, right? And the fact that Owen Shah Ismail appears in 2 of these plays, and he would have appeared in Tango to make a hat trick of it, right? It's something the fact that like I first saw him in a production of like Jean Tae's Boom and really fell in love with his performance and said, I really want to write a role for this actor. So I think it's this kind of symbiotic, quite fluid thing that happens as well.
Right, yeah. So on that note, I mean, someone says, love you, Joel Tan. Yes, there's a lot of love going around tonight. But I want to ghost Tan a little bit because I think we've got a really interesting question for Vithya, actually. Yeah. And this comes from Ursh Kaur, who says, Vithya, when writing about minorities within minorities, where media representation can shape public perception, for example, Sikhs, right? Do you feel compelled to avoid pure fiction or ugly stories or things not representative of the community?
I think I understand what Ashan means by not representative. So not towing the party line, not towing the community's own narrative of itself. And the answer is yes, definitely yes.
Okay.
And I think this is twofold. One is particularly with the Sikhs in Singapore, it's such a well-organized community that have a stronghold on your narrative, right? So it's clear what is acceptable or what is out there already, and then what is clearly out of bounds, so to speak. And then of course, the second thing is that I am not Sikh, and I would have to really make a point, if I want to like move away from that narrative. Not that I haven't wanted to, but then that I just relegate to academic writing because nobody reads that.
No, people do read. I read when I do research for my plays.
But then you don't get me in trouble.
Yes, so I think that's a very good question. That question of like representation and also public perception, right? And then I think Vithya, you did mention something about self-censoring, and I think sometimes, one makes that distinction between censorship that's coming from a very powerful body like the state versus this so-called censorship that's coming from a minority community that might not have the full means or power or representation, and therefore are very careful or kind of like insecure about how they're portrayed, right? Yeah. Okay, great. So I want to go back to Joel right now.
All right.
And I also want to say that when I watch all these like Malay characters in your plays, what I think is really interesting is that you've opened up a space for some interesting and quite complex portrayals of Malayness, and I don't want you to feel like awkward about this, but I will say, like, for example, if there's a Malay writer out there, and if he were to write a character like in Tango of a Malay person who happens to be gay, that Malay writer is in quite a vulnerable position because of community policing of what is a good Muslim and what is a good Malay person and all that. But I think what you've been able to do is that you've using your privilege as someone who's not going to be attacked by the community in those particular ways, to actually write these roles and somehow, validate the existence of actual queer Malay people out there, for example. Yeah. And even in Mosaic, there's a Malay character who drinks. Right? And the
it's,
thing is that, yeah,
no,
yeah.
go on.
Yeah, and the thing is that, of course, there are Malay people out there who drink, but within the Malay community, they're probably going to be represented as people who are hooligans and gangsters, and they've got tattoos and they're bad hats, But in your play, this Malay character, he's middle class.
He's
maybe.
a civil servant. He works with NPARK.
Was that inspired by Pooja's NParks episode?
No, this
no,
was way before.
Right. So I think, that also, in terms of the complexity, to show that, hey, there are people who are also kind of like, they're not bad hats, they're not gangsters, but they also happen to drink. I think,
Yeah.
gives rise to a much larger spectrum of what is possible in terms of like representation of Malays on stage.
Yeah. And it's like, to kind of touch on what you said earlier about people feeling that there's a kind of prohibitive quality to writing outside of your racial knowledge,
Yeah.
right? Actually, it's if you pursue it enough empathy and humanity, that's it, right? Like,
Right.
and if you approach these people with the fullness of their humanity, that's your way in, right? And I wrote a lot of these characters based on people I knew as well. So it's not as if you're writing completely outside of the realm of your knowledge, I understand.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, that's the thing, right? Just have minority friends. If you're like so scared to make minority friends, have them. So these might be like your first readers. They are the people who can do like a cultural audit, if need be, a sensitivity reader, right, of your script. Yeah. Okay. Let's move on and take a look at the next few images. I just want to touch on very briefly on this work that was written by Aswani Aswas back in 2017. It's called Absence Makes the Heart. Basically, what she did was she researched Singapore English language plays from 1962 to 2017 to look at how Indian characters were portrayed or written in those plays. Yeah, so this happens to be a scene from army days where they were sort of reenacting a Bollywood scene, and I think the critique was that it was a little bit stereotypical for this scene. But then again, it was written in the 80s, and it was too dependent on certain sort of CMIO stereotypes around that time. Yeah. Okay. As part of this work, next slide, please. There was this interesting kind of like intervention / provocation, which we did with Center 42. So the photographer Daniel Teo worked with us to take some images of actors filling in the roles in certain canonical Singapore plays that would otherwise have usually been played by actors of a specific ethnicity, right? So Emily Emerald, we always think, okay, she's this Chinese Peranakan woman, but what if an Indian actress were to play her? I mean, what is our response to that? What would it mean for someone of another ethnicity to step into those kasut manik or the beaded slippers? And then also you see Forbidden City, another play that looks at I think it's Qixi, who is the last empress of China. So you would think automatically, okay, it should be played by a Chinese actress, but what if you have an Indian one instead? Yeah. So all these, I think, are ways in which we try to challenge, but why not? And what do we then see when we have these kinds of interventions, right? Okay, next image. Okay, I'm just going to talk briefly about some of my plays. And one of the things we've been addressing is racial representation. And we've been talking about it in terms of diversity and inclusion, right? But I'm also thinking of ways in which we can create works where it's not just about putting this rainbow spectrum of people on stage, but also in looking at what is race, how is it constructed, which I think is more of what an anti-racist project or an anti-racist work would be like, yeah? So in my play GRC in 2015, what I do is I create this alternate Singapore where the racial demographics have somehow been reversed between the Malays and Chinese. So what you have is that instead of the Chinese being the majority, the Malays are majority in this particular universe. And of course, some people will say, hey, isn't that Malaysia? But no, because Malaysia is a constitutional monarchy. It's also a federal republic. I mean, the demographics also in Malaysia is 55% Malays, whereas in Singapore it's 75% Chinese, right? So I flip it over And I look at a election in Singapore, and there's this group representation constituency which has to have one minority candidate. So in my play, the minority candidate is played by a Chinese woman, and everyone else is Malay, as you can see there. So the thing is that she has to wrestle with this contradiction of, okay, I'm there to represent the Chinese community in this GRC, but then at the same time, I'm not really supposed to advocate for Chinese issues. So this is something that she's kind of wrestling with in the play, right? Because you're a representative, but are you just token because you can't really have a voice and really talk about Chinese issues? They keep on insisting to her, oh, you have to talk about national issues, you're not a single issue candidate. But her very presence in the GRC is because of her Chineseness, right? So she's trying to walk that very difficult tightrope. Yeah. So I think what I've done here is by reversing the majority-minority dynamics in Singapore, I was hoping to open up a certain space for conversation where if you see like the majority are Malays and they are the ones who are doing the microaggressions and the casual racism and all that, then maybe you won't feel so triggered because, when we're having these conversations about race, people are defensive because they think, the Chinese are going to get attacked. But what if I say in this play that we are actually just looking at the majority, and this majority could actually practically be any ethnicity, but because of their sheer numbers, structural racism actually becomes baked into that system. Yeah. So I think that's an exploration that I did in one of my plays. Next one. Okay, and this is also a very recent play. This is called Merdeka/Tuli/Sutantaram that was done last year by Rice. So again, I wanted to examine race, and I specifically wanted to look at the colonial history of race. How was race actually constructed by colonialism? Specifically, like scientific racism, right? So the thing about colonialism was that you had to justify yourselves colonizing another people. And the way to do it is to try to convince yourself that these people were inferior, that genetically they were of inferior stock, they were savages, they needed to be civilized. So I think if we look at that, it's not just about racial difference. What colonialism introduced was a racial hierarchy of difference. Right? That some races were superior, some races were inferior. And actually, this kind of discourse, we have inherited it in Singapore, unfortunately. It comes out. So this scientific racism also, it comes out when we say, you're Malay, but you're smart because you got Chinese blood, for example. Right? Or, you are of a good racial stock. And certain things like, we mustn't have mixed marriages because it will your genes with high IQ is going to be diluted with the genes of people with low IQ. So that kind of talk actually still exists, in Singapore, unfortunately, and I think a lot of it we can trace to all these discourses on colonial racism and eugenics and all that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for all that. All those images, and let's take on a few questions. So please, let's hear from you people who are watching in right now. You can direct your questions to any one of us. I will pull out a few comments. Kishan says, Jonathan is such a sensitive and beautiful writer, but of course, I am biased. Did you plan
I don't know her.
Okay.
Actually, can I jump in on something Vithya was talking about, or was asked about earlier about talking about minority communities within minority communities,
Sure.
And feeling like you can't criticize things. And I think someone like specifically with the Sikh community, someone whose work does that very beautifully is Balikor Jaswals.
Yeah.
And she really points out like patriarchal issues and how like reticent like the community is to talk about mental health. And I think there's something also to be said about the lived knowledge that comes with being from that community and being able to critique from a place of love rather than a place of ignorance. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Anyone wants to add to that? No? Okay, come. So let me just draw out some of the other questions. Yeah. There was an early one actually by Kirat Kaur. Maybe this is for you, Pooja, and everyone else. Do you think there are still quietly inclusive brown spaces in Singapore, like Kilimanjaro was back in the day?
God, but do you really want me to say it? Because then they won't be quiet and
Yeah,
secret
that's why.
anymore. And then everyone will find
You
them.
you
Correct?
you can DM Kirat, I guess.
DM me.
Yeah, Pooja brings me, but she blindfolds me along the way, so I don't know where we're going.
Yeah, but Joe he
Yeah.
can never find them again on his own.
Right. So every community needs its closely guarded secrets, right? We can't share these secret knowledge just with outsiders. This kind of thing is secret knowledge, one. Okay.
Because then you'll just infiltrate for the cheap drinks.
Yes,
No,
for the $15
no.
drinks, absolutely.
No, yeah.
Okay. Ruby has got a question for me actually. So let's see this. Ruby says, Alfian, could you talk a little bit about race and casting? How do you navigate that with multiracial characters and actors in an ensemble cast like in Merdeka? Okay. So this is a very, very good question. And I must admit that there are some works I've done where there's an ensemble that does multiple role playing, where we've had to do some kind of cross-cultural casting in the work itself. Yeah. So sometimes the cross-cultural casting would inevitably look like what is called passing. So, to pass off as a certain race, right? So we had situations where in my play Hotel, a Eurasian actor plays an Indian character, and we have received some feedback that, couldn't you have cast an Indian actor in this role? So the only not the only one of the ways that I address that is that, actually in this particular play there's a lot of cross-cultural casting, because this is the ensemble that we're working with. We have these 13 actors. At the same time, we also want to represent characters of various ethnicities. And I guess this is, I'm not saying that this is necessarily the best or most ideal way, but I really felt that this was an experiment we were making. And also in Merdeka, for example, maybe Ruby is referring to the fact that there's an actress who plays the Captain Lakshmi Swaminathan in one of the scenes regarding the Rani of Jhansi regiment, right? And this was like a Chinese actress playing an Indian character role. So when you have that, I mean, what are the kinds of precautions that you want to make? What does it mean to perform another race? So as much as I acknowledge that the limitation we're working with is that we only have these particular actors, and for that particular scene, these are the roles that we want to have. I think, my short answer is you just have to do it respectfully. You try not to turn it into a caricature. You don't try to play the ethnicity or a caricature of the ethnicity. So it means like not overdoing accents, for example. Yeah. Although I know this is a very tricky thing, because how do you play another race? Right? So I don't know, Ruby, does that answer your question? I mean, for me it's about the company, it's about the ensemble and them trying to fill in these particular, characters in the work. Yeah.
It's also a very specific kind of theatrical relationship with reality. Not
Right.
all plays have that kind of intimate relationship with reality, right? And in like plays like Merdeka, for example, there's a kind of like Brechtian aesthetics at work, right? So I feel like that creates space, you know what I mean, for
Yeah.
these kinds of like inconsistencies to work out. I'm just jumping
Right.
in here because like I wrote a play
Right.
recently called Love in
Right.
the Time of the Ancients, which
Yes.
I wrote while in the UK, and it's intended for performance there, right? And it's an ensemble cast as well, and it's multiracial. And I just wrote a stage direction going,
Yeah.
like cross-race casting should be employed, but like
Mm.
actors of a minority, actors of a majority race should not play characters of a minority race. So like there was a kind of hard and fast rule there that because like I saw it as an opportunity to create work and roles for non-white actors. You know what I mean?
Mm. Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
So it's
Right. Yeah, so I think Joel, I think you're addressing one of the issues that we sort of wrote on the copy for this particular talk, which is like colorblind versus color conscious casting,
Mm.
right? So colorblind casting is, I suppose, when we think or we where the race of that character is irrelevant. So if this particular character, like in Vithya's, your coffee maker, your character is just called A and P, right?
He and she.
So A and
Could be in he and she, but it could have been A and B as well. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and then their ethnicities, cultural backgrounds is not really central to the work itself. So I think we can do colorblind casting in that. Okay, by the way, we've got a little ticker tape down there. A shout out to a very, very good resource for those of you who want to find out and read up a lot more about race and racism, etc. You can go to that URL. Okay. Back to normal programming, Vithya. So yeah, we're talking about colorblind casting, right? Whereas I think
so I was just thinking as well when Joel was speaking about who gets to play, and we're talking about all this like cross casting.
Yeah.
But it feels like when we talk about cross casting, especially in the Singapore context, we're thinking still very CMIO boxes. Because I'm thinking about like Sikh Serangoon, and the lead Sikh character was played by another Indian guy who's not Sikh, not Punjabi either. He just happens to pass off as Sikh because he grew out his beard and wore a turban. So that even with that picture, he got identified as Sikh already suggests how hates we think about the Sikh person. But I guess also maybe we can think about where is that line that we are crossing when we say cross casting.
Okay.
Like for me, it was good enough because he was a good enough actor. He could speak the Punjabi lines with the correct Punjabi intonations, and he looked the part.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Alfian, can you pick out the question by Hoye Tang? Is that there's one that's represented? Yeah. So I think that's
Sorry,
a good.
which one is that? Yeah.
You see it right at the bottom, the latest comment.
Okay.
On the live comment.
Sure, Hoi Tang. Okay, let me pull that out.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think they're asking, does representation mean equal roles assigned for all various races, or like how MediaCorp does things, attempting to have certain percentage for each race? Where do we draw the line between forced casting and well-intended representation? So I think like that betrays, in a sense, like that we're still like Chinese people must have a role, Malay people must have a role, Indian people must have a role, and then others must have a role. And I think like for me, the problem with colorblind casting in Singapore is often that it's a way of erasing minority actors. Like it's always very easy to say it's hard to find a minority actor, so we had a Chinese person play them. Whereas color conscious casting is deeply aware of what having a person of color or a body of color on the stage means. So there's a slight difference there, right? And I think like again, it goes back to the philosophy of what bodies are we putting on stage and what are they trying to say to us? And like as what Vithya said as well, like what do we assume when we see certain bodies? Or why when a Chinese person plays an Indian person, do you feel they won't be identified as Indian unless we put them in an accent or we tie a sarong around them or like something ridiculous like that. So I think the choices we make in that already betray like the assumptions we have about bodies and racialized bodies.
Okay, great. Let me just look at some of the comments. Keep those questions in, guys. Okay, so interesting question here. Janani J says, when you guys write plays, can you put minorities into positions of power like prime ministers, etc., so that seeing this is normal?
How about we get a real brown prime minister instead?
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think? I mean, is there a certain value to doing that kind of like positive representation, role modeling on stage? Yeah.
I don't know. For me, it feels at this point, if we do it just for that sake, it just becomes another token.
Right. So you don't think it's because of Morgan Freeman that Obama became president?
No, Morgan Freeman is the voice of God.
How dare you?
You don't think it's because Hollywood put like black actors as presidents, it became true one day? But that I think is a very good question, because it's also like, what is the role of representation, right? In the ways that it helps us kind of like imagine certain possibilities that otherwise have been made quite unthinkable in Singapore. When people say you're not ready for non-Chinese PM and all that, but what if we actually walk through and we try to like depict that world, in our works and our plays,
I guess that's one way.
Mhm.
And the other way, again, to go back to Sixes Rangoon, is
Yeah.
to try to undo the erasing that has been done for so long, right? To
Mhm.
go back and to our actual past, so nothing imagined or futuristic, and pull out the characters who already exist, who were really powerful in their time, and just be
Right.
like, nah,
Yeah.
already have.
You don't need to even like be speculative or whatever, right? I mean, it's
That's a great title for a play about like erased minority histories. Nah, already
Nah.
have.
I'm writing it down.
age, yeah. Copyright Pooja Nansi. Okay. Let's see this question here from Adlina. I think it's related to what you said just now, Pooja. So, to all the panelists, if there's time, we'll always have time for you. What do you think are the implications of a majority actor playing a minority versus minority playing majority? And
I think Joel should take this question.
Okay.
No, just because I think
Yep.
I think when I worked with Joel on You Are Here, like I definitely got questions about like, oh, the play is so much about like your own kind of cultural heritage and like what is it like working with a Chinese person who doesn't get it. But like at no point did I ever feel
Mm-hmm.
that like I had a viewpoint being imposed on me, or like I was explaining myself. Like it was a real kind of joy. And
Yeah.
I'm just really, and Joltan is honestly one of the best allies I know. So I just
Right.
think that like it's important to hear him speak to this. Yeah.
Hmm.
What are the implications of a majority actor playing a minority versus a minority playing a majority? I mean, it really depends on the context. To my mind, it really is just about what kinds of opportunities are being taken away from somebody else. Like,
Right.
what kind of space is being taken away from somebody else, and what, like, living in a specific racialized body, for example, with all those memories and all of those experiences stored in the body, how is that going to inform the performance versus someone who's not lived that?
Right.
So to my mind, right, depending on
Yeah.
what kind of role it is, it could really be the difference between a good and a bad performance.
Right.
And,
Right.
and then on a kind of like logistical level, it is the difference between someone having a job and not, right? And like see, it's like, why do we need to see Scarlett Johansson playing like every kind of human being imaginable, like what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
So
what I think.
I mean, if I can sort of like dig a little deeper, I think this question is also maybe directed at you, Joel, because just now when you talk about your stage direction, being that majority actors shouldn't play minority, but minority playing majority, that's you want that inside the play. So I guess some people might come in and say, oh, but that doesn't sound like it's fair. How do you address those
It is
kinds
very
of
fair. Like white people, I mean, in the context of the play that I was writing for, white people have had a good run for 500 years or more.
Okay.
You know what I mean? It's like get out of the way, honestly. And if there is a role that is written, for a white person, sure, go for it, right? But like, why should you want to play a black person? In that realm of argument, I guess.
Right. So this is interesting because I think like someone who's gonna ask you about this will talk about racial equality, but I feel like what you're doing in this work is actually racial justice, which actually takes a sort of historical view of who have been getting the roles, as you mentioned, for like the past 500 years. I mean, they were playing Othello, they were playing, right? All these roles which weren't even written for them. So now it's time to flip the page. Yeah. And I also think, I mean, this is the distinction between Hamilton, where you have white presidents played by people of color, right? Which we all celebrate and which we think is such an interesting intervention, versus this play that I think it was like a German production or something like that, where they wanted to do Katori Hall's The Mountaintop, and they wanted to cast Martin Luther King. They wanted to cast a white person in that role.
Classic German
Okay. The
maneuver.
question is why?
Right? I don't know. But
They've so far transcended.
yeah, but we
No,
can
but
see
was it some level of like self-reflexive irony in the play,
Yeah,
or like
so
like
okay, I might get the German bit wrong, but it could be okay. But let's not sort of like pile on the Germans. But I think there was a kind of like postmodern kind of like I'm playing Martin Luther King. This is a white person playing King, and let's have the audience be very conscious of that. And yeah,
which is great if we were in a post-racial society,
Exactly.
but clearly as the world is showing us, we're not.
I mean, are we living in an epidemic of like
Mhm.
white people not getting these parts? No, right? We're not. It reminds me of like when the Wooster Group came to Singapore, right? And then they were doing a production of, I think it was Troilus and Cressida. And they were doing this very like postmodern European kind of approach. And then like a bunch of white people running around the stage in Native American garb, trying to pass that off as some kind of like ironic position on race and identity. And it was just like tasteless and quite distasteful. Yeah.
So this is interesting, Joel, because when you talk about irony, right? I'm reminded. I mean, sorry, I'm just gonna drag this in, sis. But like I think last week there was this. I saw on social media just this image that was taken 4 years ago, and it's RJC students who were in blackface, and they were in that as a way of celebrating their friend's birthday. And what I thought was very interesting about the image is we know it's racist, but knowing very hyper intelligent teens from elite schools, I can see where the intention was, oh, this is a parody of racism. It can't be racist. I mean, we're too intelligent. Of course we know blackfacing is wrong, but we are giving this a kind of ironic twist. We are turning this into a parody of racism, but no, right? It still is. It
Yeah,
still
it's
is.
like, do we live in a world where that performance could not hurt somebody? No, we
Right.
don't live in that world, right? So, patently that's not a question,
Right, yeah. So when you mention Wooster Group, for example, I do feel that sometimes, certain artists, they use this as a kind of shield, right? It's like we're not representing it straight, there's always a kind of like, no, this is a parody of it. This is, there's no sincere racism in it. We are drawing attention to racism rather than just being racist. Yeah. Okay. Got quite a few other questions. A lot actually. Okay. Let's see. After Hoyle Tang. Okay, Nazri Bahrawi. Great sharing, he says. What do the panelists feel about developing a Singapore-specific vocabulary for talking about race? Okay, it must be qualified that this has been, of course, used to downplay racism here, that we are not America. Okay, but if this move is to be a good thing, where do we begin? So let me just give, I suppose, a few examples. Like when we use words like privilege, a lot of times the counter to that is like, oh, but it's so American centric. It's like from Peggy McIntosh. That's a society that's dealt with slavery and Jim Crow laws and segregation, all that. So that situation does not apply, and we cannot use that kind of language. It cannot be mapped onto the Singapore situation. So, what are the possibilities of developing our own kind of indigenous discourse on race?
I mean, I think we're already trying to unpack it, on a daily basis. I do think that our kind of model of multiculturalism is a complicated one because it kind of so defines us by race, but at the same time, like talking about race is this big boogeyman. So you're stuck in this kind of bind where you're like, I'm like, my race is on my IC. I get calls because like I need racial representation. Like people have no hesitation saying, I'm sure all of us have got that, right? Like no hesitation being told like, oh, we need racial representation. Can you please be on this panel? Or like, can you please, and then, so your race is very much stamped on you. But then at the same time, like, I can't talk about it. Yeah. So I think as a writer, like that's one of the things that was the first struggle for me when I was younger and writing about it was the only way I learned how to write about race, and also because I came from the slam scene, which is very, political and immediate, was to be like, that's not me, that's not me, that's not me, that's who you say I am, and that's not me. And that meant that all the time my work wasn't setting its own agenda. It was just kind of reacting to other people telling me what I'm not.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm still navigating that. Like, I'm still unlearning how not to like react and write from who I am. Yeah.
Right. Any other responses to that?
I guess it starts also with using terms that we already use in local conversation, right? So the insider vocabulary, if that makes sense. So not just talking about blackface, or in this case brown face, but using, like, really putting out all the terms we use. So manjan, kalinga, kaling, whatever. Right? And just being comfortable with those words that for so long we've been told to, like, shh, cannot say out loud. But at the same time, it's, as much as we're trying to find this indigenous discourse, I don't think we're trying to also say that this has to be separate from the global discourse, because at the end of the day, it started because we are connected to the whole global scene. So we kind of have to like work both at the same time. A lot of work.
Yes, completely. I mean, something like colorism is so universal, right? It's and you find it like even within like certain communities who identify as one racial group. Yeah. Okay. I think we could go at a little bit more. Nabila Said has a question here. As minority writers, how do you deal with being tone policed when people say that your play is too angry, for example? So sometimes people say, you're so brave for writing X, which I'm not sure is better either. Okay. Anyone wants to take this?
Sorry, Choba, I just need to plug my Mac in, but like I'll just pop out screen, but please carry on.
No worries. Yes. No worries, Pooja. Anyone wants to take this? I guess, Joel, you will recuse yourself.
I guess my response so far is to just don't say anything because I'm still scared. But I think one strategy would be, and maybe this also answers one of the previous questions about writing about someone else, for instance, which is to just show your working. Right? Like, in MedSum, right, you show all the steps you got before your final conclusion, so that even if someone doesn't agree with your final conclusion, they can see how you work it through. And what I mean by showing your working is short of flashing footnotes on this title, which I would love to do, is to do something like how in Merdeka, the characters were actually giving you their citations, right? You're like, this fella's speech from whatever year.
Right. Yeah.
Or in this text, this fella said. So I guess that's one way to counter tone policing, to be like, no, I say one, the sources say.
Right. Yeah. I mean, my response to that is, well, why don't you have a right to be angry?
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, why, considering the experiences that you've been through, etc., that is actually a very natural and actually human response. If you felt discriminated against, if you felt oppressed, whatever, obviously anger is the most natural thing to feel. Yeah. Okay. So
can I just jump in here and like relay an experience working with Pooja and you are here. So I think a few days before we opened for the third show, it was like the Our Boys to Men saga. Do you remember that? So or some like racist event or another lah. But like so, a few days before opening the show, Pooja was online battling all of these like anti-social justice warriors type, right? Who kept coming at her, home policing her and other people who were criticizing the thing, saying, your anger is not, it's not useful here. Your anger is not gonna get us anywhere. Like, check your feelings, because what we need now is rational debate. And I kept thinking, in comparison to the show which we were about to open, which often makes you sit with a lot of anger and shame, it felt right, because rational debate will never admit those things as being valid or useful. But that is the heart and the meat of all minority experience, right? And I speak here obviously as a queer person. I felt that anger, and I feel like that's why art is such a an important space because it's where you go when rational debate, in a way, fails you, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think a lot of the things that we believe in, I mean, you can't take out the effective dimension from it at all. And actually, even certain things like deciding who to vote for is sometimes not just a purely intellectual exercise. It's really about who you feel closest to, who you feel connected with, all these. So I just brush aside when people say facts are not feelings and all those kind of like bye. Okay, next. Shalin Rajendran has got a question here. It's a question, a comment followed by a question. She says, since race is intertwined with class, sexuality, gender, religion, nationality, etc., how do you think through this multiplicity in relation to today's questions about identity, which are increasingly linked to being millennial, Gen Z, etc.? What are the new narratives of racial identity that tap onto these categories? Wow. I know you all squinting.
Sorry, like you're just digesting.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, today's focus is on race, right? Yeah. But I guess, you're bringing in all these other dimensions of identity because obviously we're not as human beings, it's not just one marker of identity that defines us.
I mean, I have a very kind of simplistic answer to this, which is like something that I struggle with on a personal level.
Yeah.
It's a very simple thing. Like, for example, like the number of times someone has asked me why I don't speak Tamil, even though I'm Indian.
Yeah.
And just kind of the reductive ways in which we understand race in this country, and like, so I'm Gujarati, but like also I can't read or write the language because I didn't learn it as my mother tongue. I learned Malay as my mother tongue,
Right.
So there's all those complexities. And I think like generationally, I think someone earlier in the live comments brought up how the face of families are changing in Singapore. There's so many more interracial marriages.
Yeah, let me pull that out also. Yeah, it's Lebanese, right? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and so many more like, mixed race kids and how they're going to navigate their racial identity is going to be even more complicated than like what it's been for all of us. So I think it's definitely complicating. And I think like at the core of it or at the crux of it for me is for us to learn how to be comfortable with difference and like resist categorizing. And I think in Singapore we love a category, we need to explain people to themselves, and I think like that gets in the way, and it's how we've been taught to talk about race, and I think we need to unteach ourselves that.
Right.
Yeah.
Any other responses
and
to
on both
Vanisa's?
sides too. And teaching ourselves both as writers but also as audience to not see someone on stage and like, this is the Indian character, this is the Chinese one.
Right.
Like, okay, this is first person, this is like,
Yep.
Everyone's got to do that work.
Okay. So there's someone called Geraldine who's like apparently he's like trolling people. So
I know.
So
Condone?
Don't troll.
Condone, please. So anyway, let's look at other questions. So let's see. Wow, some of the question damn long leh.
Faisal has a great question.
Who's got a question? Sorry.
Muhammad Faisal Abdullah has a great question about writing a minority story in English as opposed to your mother tongue.
Okay, okay. Faisal Abdullah, right? Got it. There we go.
Good question.
Ooh. Okay. So Faisal asks, what are your thoughts on writing about minority story in English as opposed to mother tongue? Okay. Anyone wants to take this?
For me, it's just been that I don't speak, like in my everyday life, I don't speak one language.
Yeah.
Like I think most of us in Singapore are effectively more multilingual than we give ourselves credit for. And like the way we speak is always a quite a chapalang mix of like Singlish plus like whatever other languages we speak. And so it's also about like writing the minority story in the voice that you speak. It has been very interesting for me. Yeah. Because there's also some things that you there's also some apparatus that you enable by writing only in English or feeling like you can't include parts of your own language in the story. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I think
Any
there's also
other
a
responses?
pragmatic.
Yes.
There's also a pragmatic concern here is that if the idea is to share your story with people outside of your mother tongue group, then you say it in a language that's most accessible, and that's going to be English. Yeah, I mean, short of
I
putting
don't
subtitles
know.
on everything.
I don't know if I agree with that, Vidya.
Yeah, I mean, that's one argument lah.
Yeah.
I would prefer a script that has like all the languages and all the scripts that
Yeah.
go on in my head,
Right.
which would
Yeah.
make the subtitlist cry. But
Mm.
there's also some pragmatic concerns to it, I guess.
Mm.
My kind of dream for
Yeah.
like the English
Yeah.
language theatre in
Yeah.
Singapore is that it is, I mean, it's already like that, already a linguistically quite hybrid space, right? And I think that like if it could move even further and more like ambitiously in that direction, that would be really exciting because we do live in a linguistically hybrid environment, right? And sometimes I wonder about how kind of fixed the English language theatre here can sound sometimes, right?
And I think we underestimate,
Pooja.
what audiences can access or not access based on language. Like we feel like people will switch off if they don't get something. But then I always when I teach creative writing, I always ask my students if they read like Enid Blyton or anything when they were kids. And then I remember reading this book and it was like, oh, the children had treacle pudding. And I was like, I don't know what that is, but I can assume that it's a kind of food, right? And so like all our lives, we've dealt with like American terms or like British terms of things that we don't know and we somehow figure it out. So I don't know why it would be so difficult for someone else to figure it out in context. Yeah.
Right.
Can I also ask, what's minority story though?
I mean, I think it's in quotation marks, so this person is aware that it's a giant broad category.
Yeah. I
I
suppose
just wanted to point out that just because we are minorities, that all stories we write is a minority stories.
Yeah,
Right.
no, you're right.
Yeah.
Because like so much of what we write is actually so universal.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like this question is something very relevant to my own practice as well because I write in both Malay as well as English, right? And the thing is that in Malay language theatre, because of the use of subtitles, I think at the end of the day, it's still accessible to people who don't speak that Malay language. But I do think that there are some structural issues that have to do with what language you choose.
For sure.
Which will be sort of like tied in with who are the theatre companies who will stage your work in that language. So if we look at, say, if I write something in Malay and then the Malay language companies are not as well resourced as the English language ones in Singapore, then I will expect, let's say, maybe I get paid less, but I'm perfectly fine with that, Or in terms of it's the audience size is going to be smaller. The space also, we will never put a play on at the Esplanade 2000 seater, for example, for Malay language theatre. So I think those are the sort of like structural differences. So the stories, I think, for me, I don't think there's a really significant difference once we bring in subtitling. But I think in terms of like, the spaces you perform in, the audiences that really come for the play. Yeah. Okay.
I think like all this conversation around minority story and like minority characters and like minority, like it still, I think it betrays this divide, right? And that's why like this panel is necessary. Is that the fact that our stories still aren't seen as centered? Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess like a segue from that is this, where Noel says there's been some comments about focusing less on race and more on our Singaporean identity. So do any of you develop characters that are distinctly Singaporean with little other categorization, and how do you go about that?
So if I put myself on stage as a Gujarati girl who's been in Singapore since she was 6 months old, and I speak Malay, I speak Singlish, is that a Gujarati story or is that a Singaporean story?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's it, right? So the Singaporean identity, I mean, why do you have to sort of vacate the racial identity from it? I
Yeah.
think that's the question. Yeah, I think the bigger question is when we say Singaporean,
Who do we
what is
mean?
the image that we have in our
Yeah.
heads? Who do we think when we say typical Singaporean? I think that's more the question that we deal with, right? Then if our idea of a Singaporean is, let's say, a middle-aged Chinese woman or something like that, yeah, then I think the work is, we need to do the work in trying to like unpack why that
Yeah.
is. Yeah. Okay. Let's
Can I
see.
make a wholly
Sure.
unrelated
Yeah.
sort of a U-turn? Robert McCord would like everyone to know he's single, if anyone is wondering.
Okay.
I'm
Nice.
gonna go look.
Yeah, you can check it out. Those of you who are still single, let's see that Robert McCord. Hi, Robert.
Yeah, there you go. See, he
Hi.
looks lovely.
Nice.
He looks
He's
like a really nice man.
a nice person. So I'm not sure whether you stumbled into the right panel. There might be one out there on like
The wrong cam for cam channel.
yeah, the wrong end. That's perfect. Okay, so I want to see. I think we should be wrapping out pretty soon. But I just want to see whether there are any final questions from our audiences. Okay, so let's maybe have this to maybe like wrap things up. From Farah Mohan. When portraying minorities in Singapore, which approach do you feel is the most powerful in terms of conveying the minority experience? The representation of experiences of discrimination, or presenting minority characters as the complex people that they are?
I don't think it's an either or.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it's an either or. I think it. I think when we start talking about how we need to portray minority people and what is the way, like you're already kind of narrowing the possibilities of what a minority body is, and that is that we are as fully rounded as anybody else. Like we face discrimination, we face joy, we have constipation, we fall in love. All those things that happen to you happen to us.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
My approach.
Yes,
Sorry, Alfian, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, like my approach to characters has been to not try to figure this out from the get-go, but to start from somewhere else, right? So like with Six Serangoon, I use place. So who was there in the place? And then that's going to inform who's my character. And then with Coffee Maker, it's just a story about the objects. And so even the humans were essentially objects, you know? So I feel like if you do that, and because no matter what, people always perform an identity, whether or not they do that consciously, whether it's a learned behavior or whatnot. So to kind of, without reiterating that and just repeating the same terms and labels, if I go from a different angle and kind of just pull from there, if that makes sense.
Okay. We do have a few other questions trickling in, and I think this might be a nice one to maybe end today's discussion. Where do we go from here? So just as a summary, this will be archived. So for those of you who join us later, you can catch up on what you missed. But in the beginning, we did share some of the plays that I think have been done in Singapore, which have dealt with racial representation as well as anti-racism. Yeah. Now, after all that discussion, this big question, where do we go from here then? How can we maybe find new ways to talk about race, find a new lens to look at race?
Invite Geraldine to our place.
I would like that, actually. That would be quite special.
So I haven't been
one-to-one. Yeah.
So I haven't been around for the past 3 years. So correct me if I'm out of touch, right? But maybe it's a programming thing as well, alongside what people are actually writing for, right? It's like what are companies actively programming, and what kind of platforms are people actively creating to make space, right? Where I think to find new ways of saying and doing and making, you just need to throw some artists in a room and have them just try and see what happens, right? And you can't do that if you expect really polished end products. You need to make space for all kinds of messy playing around. And I think on some level it's institutional as well as artistic, right? Yeah.
I think Natalie, like Sutanto, has a really nice kind of response,
Yep.
which is that it may be more useful to emphasize the complexities of
Complexities.
Singaporeanness. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. Rather than to make this distinction between like,
Yeah.
oh, can we forego race or can we sort
Yeah.
of ignore race and don't see race and then
Yeah.
see what is instead the Singaporeans. Yeah. So I like this kind of like expansive
Yeah.
approach to identity. Yeah, that can accommodate all our multitudes. Okay.
Yeah.
So great. Wow, so many messages coming in, but maybe I saw something by Sangeeta, which is actually quite lovely. And I think she speaks for I think most of us. Where do we go from here? I think she just answered this. I'm sorry, I have to block you out, Pooja and
It's
Joel.
all right.
It's okay.
We're making space for you, Sangeeta. So she says, for the longest time, the burden of awareness and voicing out has rested heavily on the oppressed. When the oppressors are called out, it feels uncomfortable for them, and many counter with responses that do nothing to help, or worse, they police your pain in an effort to mask their discomfort. So she's saying there is no one solution. But if you're from a majority race, I would say please try this one thing as a start. Listen, and not just to reply. Listen to your minority friends and make sure they feel seen. So I like this because the onus of where do we go from here is not just on us, right? It's not on cultural workers and cultural producers. It's also for the audience out there. I mean, it's a national issue. It's a society-wide responsibility. Yeah. Okay. Any final thoughts or questions? Okay, guys.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Yay.
And maybe we can end off with like some group hug thing. Excellent, honest conversation tonight.
Yeah. Thank you so
Oh, well
thank you
done,
so
well
for
done.
Not
convening
afraid
us.
to deal with difficult and challenging issues and comments in an honest and uncensored way. Thank you. And Nabila
Aw.
also says something. Oh, yeah. Thank you for your presences on this panel. Thanks for some very insightful and wonderful commentary in the live chat. Okay. Thank you again to all of
Thanks,
you.
Alfian.
Thank
Thank
you,
you so
Thanks,
much. Thank you
Alfian.
so
everyone.
much.
Thanks,
And I hope
everyone.
that all of you can go and check the works that we've listed today. And Race Resources SG, could we bring out that banner again? There you go. Okay. So if you want to find out more about race and all that, you have that. Everyone, point. So it's not a subscribe point. It's a ticker. Pooja, you
Always
didn't get a
wanted to be a
Oh, sorry.
YouTuber.
I just keep pointing out.
memo. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good night. Bye
Thank
bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.